Game Boy Advance was no stranger to quality platformers. There were plenty of games for fans of the genre to enjoy, but much like the first game in the series on the PlayStation 1, Klonoa 2 found itself hitting below the radar, and as a result didn't get as much of a fair shake as the more popular franchises on the handheld did. All the elements from the Klonoa franchise have returned, and many things have stayed the same. Mainly the goal of each stage, which is to use enemies, blocks and many other resources available to you to seek out free star stones and reach the exit. To do this, you'll be forced to capture enemies with Klonoa's ring, to use them as a sort of double jump to get over walls or obstacles, or having to hurl them at a switch or breakable item in order to advance. In the beginning, the levels involve pretty much just that, tossing and jumping on enemies, but things soon get much more complicated after the first simple levels, unlike the title before this one, which had simple puzzles that even repeat themselves. But even with the difficulty, this game still doesn't cause a lot of frustration. If you've played the previous installment on the GBA, nothing will seem new. About half of the sprites and animations have been recycled, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. All of the animations and environments look crisp, colourful and detailed, plus the game's cutscenes can be somewhat amusing too. Everything runs smoothly as well, with absolutely no frame drops, which makes playing Klonoa 2 an absolute delight. If you're on the lookout for something new to add to your collection, Klonoa 2 well and truly deserves a spot. Scourge Hive was released for two of Nintendo's handheld systems, both the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS. It saw you assuming the role of Genosa, an elite bounty hunter who's been hired to discover what happened to a secret military research lab after a series of strange distress calls. On the way there, your spaceship is shot at as you approach the lab, and as you investigate the damage, you discover that your ship and your body have been infected with the Scourge. The Scourge is some sort of hive mind bioenergy being which lives only to spread itself and take over anything it can. This aspect goes hand in hand with the gameplay, which has some great ideas. Now the game takes place from an isometric perspective and is essentially a shooter. You run around shooting enemies and solving puzzles to open new doors and get keycards to let you progress further through the complex. Most of the action is blasting enemies and careful jumping, although there are some special items which are mostly useful for solving puzzles. The star of the show is the Scourge infection itself though. As time passes on, your infection level climbs from 1 to 100%, and when it reaches 100, your HP begins to drain. This is a great mechanic which adds a ton of tension to the otherwise undistinguished platforming shooting adventure. The biggest flaw in the gameplay, however, is the lack of variety. Every single level is the same. You run around collecting keycards and opening doors, drag security orbs to open locks to the boss door, go in, kill the boss, rinse and repeat. Thankfully, the action more than makes up for the general lack of diversity, and while never reaching the highs of say the Metroid series, Scourge Hive is still well worth checking out. Iridion 2 is the sequel to the launch title Iridion 3D and is a fine example of a developer learning from their mistakes. But with the bad reputation the first entry has, many passed this one by not knowing what they were missing. Sometimes it seems a little redundant explaining the gameplay portion of a shooter, but there are some new additions here. The changes are few, but make everything seem so different from the last installment, starting with the new perspective that the game takes, which is that of a vertical scrolling somewhat isometric view, instead of a rear view like the first game. This simple change makes it 10 times easier to see what the actual hell is going on, and instantly makes Iridion 2 far superior. As with most shooters, you can expect to have a generous amount of weaponry, which can all be upgraded throughout the course of the game, mainly by acquiring special items known as pods that add a serious punch to your offensive efforts. There are two bosses for a stage, one in the middle and one at the end, with all of them having some interesting or creative attacks to throw at you, but most of the time they don't provide that much of a challenge, unless faced in hard mode, and even then they aren't the hardest bosses in the world. In fact, the whole game is actually rather easy outside of hard mode, so I recommend that you skip easy and normal to get the most enjoyment out of it. I'm not gonna lie, the game is also incredibly short, and doesn't really offer up any sort of replay value once you've made your way through it. Despite that though, Iridion 2 provides what is quite possibly one of the most technically impressive games on the GBA. If you're a lover of shooters, this is definitely one to add to your list. When you think of a ninja game, what do you imagine? Perhaps something along the lines of Shinobi or Ninja Gaiden? Do you see a vast empire stretching across the Orient like in Dynasty Warriors? Or maybe you envision these 4 pizza-loving turtles from New York City. You never even consider an urban police detective working the gritty city scene. Enter Joe, the lead crime detective of the precinct. This ex-ninja has changed occupations, opting for a more practical line of work. Of course, old habits die hard, and despite the bland name and presumably low-paying salary, Joe still retains all of the elite training of the ninja discipline. Using his superior abilities, Joe is able to crack down on the massive crime wave hitting the city, and instead of carrying around a 9mm and a bulletproof vest, the detective is armed with a thin shroud of fabric and his trusty sword. Using only the basic tools of the ninja, it's up to you to stop whatever illegal activities that lay in your path and restore safety to the community. And as our ninja makes his way through the rough and tough areas of the city, you'll have to face all sorts of evil and twisted minions of the seedy underground. Thankfully, his mad ninja skills come in handy time and time again. You've got a standard katana to bring down some heavy-duty punishment on the evildoers, and in case you find yourself in a tight situation, our hero comes with an unlimited supply of throwing stars. If you don't want to risk close-range combat, you can launch a few of these projectiles at your enemies and watch as their star-ridden corpses collapse onto the cold floor. And if that isn't enough, your throwing stars can be upgraded into fireballs and lasers to add even more spice to your deadly arsenal. Of course, Joe has got one last trick up his sleeve, and it all revolves around a small gauge at the top of the screen. If you let the gauge fill up, you can execute an attack of unprecedented speed and deadly accuracy. All these years later, I've always hoped that in some form we could get a continuation of the series, but much like any other Konami property, it looks like it's destined to be forgotten. When it comes to racing, the Game Boy Advance was no slouch. With the likes of Mario Kart and F-Zero, the handheld provided many different takes on the genre, but one that never got the attention it deserved had to be GT Advance 3. After a minor detour in the form of a rally racing game, GT Advance returned for its third entry, and this time around it was remarkably similar to the first game of the series, although many of the minor issues had been ironed out, resulting in a much better and more enjoyable racing game. Now, unlike most other races on the system that focus more on casual play, GT Advance 3 took it up a notch and attempted to provide a realistic experience. But did it succeed? Well, for the most part, yes. The best way to think about it is that it's like a sort of bite-sized Gran Turismo. Players will choose a car and then race in a series of events, unlocking parts and cars as they go. As with the first and second games, the driving is very simple. Provided you know the function of an accelerator and a brake, you should be fine. Unlike its predecessors, there really isn't much precision driving to be found, nor is it necessary, because the opponent's AI isn't that challenging. Rather than picking out the perfect line through a track, players are better off just throwing on the brakes and sliding through corners. It may not require a lot of skill, but it sure is a blast to play. I can't say if GT Advance 3 is the best racer on the Game Boy Advance, but this is certainly the best I've encountered, and arguably the best title in the GT Advance series. If you want to always have a racing title close by, this game will certainly fit the bill. There's collecting, racing, minigames and multiplayer, you just cannot go wrong. Astro Boy begins with the birth of the robot boy himself. After dying in a horrible car collision, Tobio is reborn as Astro Boy. The game begins at this point, with your doctor teaching you how to play. From here on begins a strong and constantly moving narrative that in fact has more depth and soul than many of the games you'll find on the handheld. The story explores all sorts of moral questions, and even relationships between people and robots. You wouldn't believe a side-scroller could pull this off, but Astro Boy hits it right out of the park. Of course, the story wouldn't be much without the gameplay to back it up, and Astro Boy delivers in spades. Utilizing a combination of punching, kicking, jet propulsion and lasers, it's your job to crush every enemy in your path while also saving human and robot lives. Mostly, gameplay consists of traveling from one end of the screen to another, but the game is broken up by all different kinds of obstacles. In one area, you'll have to navigate a deadly electrical maze, or in another, you'll need to fight your way down an elevator shaft. Basically, the game almost never bogs you down with a dull moment, but the bosses Man, this is where the game takes it to the next level. You can really tell Hitmaker took their time to make sure that every boss battle was as unique and fun as possible, with each of them offering up their own distinct challenge that tests your knowledge of the mechanics in play. With its solid sprite work, colourful levels, great animations, and awesome sprite scaling effects, a lot of thought must have gone into the game's artwork, and it really shines through every pixel. It's a wonder why this game didn't fly off the shelves. It has everything going for it. Once you beat it, you're not even done. The game unlocks more for you to do, and even more story to be uncovered. Ignore the fact that this game is based on a license and a kids show and pick it up. It's just that good. When Pokemon was released in Japan in 1996, it was a huge success, leading to many clones for various systems, but mostly for the Game Boy. Of these, a few were actually quite original, despite having borrowed so much from Pokemon to begin with. One of these was a game called Metabots by Natsume. The Game Boy Advance version is essentially a remake of the first game, with the plot revolving around a gang of thieves called the Rubbero Gang, a police force, a masked superhero, and of course our main character Icky, who is a walking database of Metabots, and who also happens to get caught up in the conflict between the three groups after buying a Metabot with money he was supposed to use to buy dinner with. Like I mentioned earlier, Metabots was a knockoff of the Pokemon concept. However, Metabots does it with a big twist. Instead of collecting monsters to be raised and evolved, players collect robot parts and mix and match them as they please to create their own custom robots. Each of them must consist of 6 parts: head, torso, left and right arms, legs, a central processor known as metal, and finally a TIMPAD, which is basically a skeleton. All of these pieces have their own attributes. However, only the metal gains experience, and throughout play it will constantly change shape, depending on how many times you use them on your robot. Targeting specific parts of enemies' bodies will either speed up or hinder the process, depending on which robot and attack you are using. There's a lot of trial and error involved, but once it clicks, it soon becomes one of the most engaging battle systems you'll find on the handheld. If you fancy dipping your toes into the world of Metabots, the GBA release offers the perfect jumping on point and will no doubt satisfy longtime fans of the genre with its intricate gameplay and systems. Boktai is quite possibly one of the most unique games available on the GBA, if not one of the most unique games of all time. It sees you taking on the role of a solar boy known as Django, son of a famous vampire hunter Ringo. Formerly famous, that is, as he recently died at the hands of the Count, an immortal demon wreaking havoc on the world. The undead are taken over, entire species are dying out, and the earth is changing for the worse. As his son, you are not only entitled to revenge, but also to his legacy, the Gun de Sol, a potent weapon which uses the power of the sun to defeat undead foes. Now, as far as gameplay goes, Boktai's claim to fame is the cartridge's most prominent feature, a solar sensor. The sensor picks up on solar light, which is used in the game for multiple purposes. Many of the events are affected by the amount of light hitting the sensor, such as traps, puzzles, even enemies. In a related area, Boktai has an incredibly sophisticated timekeeping feature as well. After entering an initial time and date and selecting the region where you live, the game will intelligently determine near precise times for sunrise, sunset, and even full moons. This is reflected in-game with changing environments depending on the time of day. For example, zombies won't go outside in the daytime, but other enemies may be more prevalent. Boktai's gameplay is more than just a glossy polish though. Kojima's influence is clear, as a major element of the game is stealth. Sure, you can run up to an enemy and blast him to smithereens, but more often than not this will make Django very dead very fast. The trick is to use your stealth techniques, looking around, wall crawling and wall knocking to distract and manipulate your enemies, making them easy to defeat or avoid entirely. Overall, being tied to the sun in order to play, quite simply, might just be too demanding and problematic for many people, but if you're lucky enough to live somewhere sunny, Boktai will not disappoint. Starting out life on the PlayStation 2, the Zone of the Enders series wouldn't be something you'd think would be possible on the GBA, but the Fist of Mars is a strategic RPG that leaves behind the 3D action of the originals and offers a completely different take on the franchise. You control an army of mechs on a map divided into a grid, with each scene having its own objective. It may be to kill all enemy forces, it may be to defeat the boss. The scenarios are pretty diverse, and it's generally very easy to tell what you're supposed to do, moving and attacking attacking with your units is the order of the day, and you can use the terrain to boost your defensive capabilities. When you attack and defeat enemy units, you gain experience and may level up, as well as cash which can go toward upgrading your mechs in between the scenes. You can also gain extra abilities by downloading them from local servers, which are scattered throughout certain areas on the mission maps. In addition, as you defeat enemies or sustain attacks, your spirit rises. When you reach certain amounts of spirit points, your mech will gain new attacks as well. These attacks are insane, allowing you to do much more damage than before. Add to that a couple of in-battle abilities such as repair and supply, and you pretty much have the game's combat in a nutshell. Now, there are actually two ways to play the battles in the game. You've got standard and IAS, or interactive action system. When you attack, you are given a certain amount of time to hit your enemy, and you must lock on to your moving target and fire. When attacked, several crosshairs will appear on the screen, and your job is to avoid them all by the time the time limit runs out. Which method you use is really just a matter of preference. IAS is by far the easier mode, which also adds an element of action to the game. Now, when it comes to visuals, considering that this is not on a home system, the graphics are pretty cool. The battle animations are quite impressive and vary considerably from mech to mech. This game proves that the power of a machine has no bearing over visual quality, as if it's in the hands of a competent developer, they'll be able to play to the system's strengths, and Zone of the Enders on the GBA is a great example of exactly that. If you're fond of strategic RPGs, The Fist of Mars is well worth checking out. Ugdra Union is a strategic RPG that comes from the same people responsible for Avira and Disgaea. With that kind of resume, you'd expect it to be one of the most well-known and celebrated games on the system, but for some reason it just never hit the mark and would go on to be largely forgotten by many players. Now, the game has two main characters. The first one is Ugdra, a princess in exile from her country after it's invaded and ultimately taken over. She crosses paths with a somewhat stereotypical thief Millenor, who agrees to help her regain her throne. When it comes to gameplay, it's a grid-based SRPG, with the most basic type of combat being when one individual challenges another. Rather than exchanging blows one-on-one though, each side begins the clash with the strength of 6 warriors. And here's Ugdra Union's major catch: each side can only initiate one skirmish per turn. In order to involve the full force of your party in that single exchange, you must form a union, this game's terminology for unit formation, as well as take advantage of a card system in which you build a deck of cards before the battle begins. Different cards grant you a bonus to the amount of damage you do, increase the number of moves you can make, and grant certain abilities to use in battle. They become central to taking on the enemy, and finding as many of them as you can throughout the world is something you'll want to keep in mind as you make your way through it. If you've exhausted the usual suspects on the GBA like Fire Emblem or Advance Wars, Ugdra Union is a solid SRPG that well and truly deserves a look. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for part 2 as that'll be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified. You can follow me on all of the socials to stay up to date, and also join our growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to our Patreon supporters Rhino, Skill Jim, Nano, Steve, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Quinn, Dio and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. You'll find all of the links in the description. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you next time.